What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen, and I am back with another true crime video. So today we're going to be speaking about the brutal attack and murder of 7-year-old Sherrice Iverson. Now, I am just going to warn you now that I have never, in the entirety of my channel, looked into a case that has lit such a fire of rage within me. This entire case is so wildly frustrating. The amount of times that I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, the amount of times that I personally have wanted to be face to face with someone involved in this case to speak my mind is just unreal. So buckle in, it's a lot to digest. And I don't know if it's just because I've come off of a bunch of very upsetting cases regarding children over the past couple of weeks, but just prepare yourself. So this case in particular inspired a lot of change, which is why we're talking about it. And it just raised a lot of questions in general on so many different levels. I felt like that meme the whole time I was researching with all of the numbers and equations and strings, and I'm just like, wow, there's so much going on, and how did this get here? And there's just so much. And one of the largest questions within this case revolves around morality and laws and how those two things intertwine. And the largest conversation in the aftermath was about duty to act laws, or Good Samaritan laws. And if you've been on my channel for any period of time, you would know this is a hot topic here. We talk about this quite a lot. And you would also know that these laws, while they seem like they should be obvious and they should exist, that they also are incredibly complicated. Way more complicated than they seem. This case highlights that a whole lot. For most of us, I feel, if we see a problem or someone in danger, without hesitation, we call for help, a professional for help. But for some, including some in this video, that thought never crossed their mind. Now, before I get into the very nitty-gritty details of this case, I first want to say a massive thank you to Audible for partnering with me on today's video. You guys already know Audible has supported my channel for about 3 to 4 years at this point, and it allows me to do what I do, create these videos, and give back to these families and victims of true crime as much as I possibly can. Audible is the leading provider for spoken word entertainment, whether you're someone that enjoys new popular podcasts or exclusive Audible originals or best-selling audiobooks. You can find all of that conveniently on the Audible app. And their vast array of genres means that there is something for absolutely everyone. So if you're like me and you absolutely thrive in an environment filled with mysteries and thrillers, have that, as well as memoirs, science fiction, there is self-help, there's children's audiobooks. And so I assure that there is something within all of their content that will suit your needs and be something that you are able to enjoy. Now, members also get a ton of great perks, which is like top tier of my list of reasons why I love Audible. You as a member get to choose one title a month from their entire catalog. That includes their bestsellers, it includes new releases. And so I personally take this as a great time to snag a book that I've been eyeballing for quite some time. It's like this monthly treat to myself. And members also get full access to a growing selection of content that is simply included in your membership. And this has been like the most pleasant surprise because I get very stuck in a box in terms of the audiobooks that I listen to, the content that I consume. And so this has kind of pushed me out of my little box, out of my comfort zone. It's led me to a bunch of different audiobooks that I might not have otherwise gravitated towards myself. So the opportunity here is just absolutely endless. Now, speaking of your one monthly title, I just used mine to grab an audiobook that I've been curious about for a very long time, probably since it came out, I believe, in March, called The Long Weekend. Now, you guys, I don't know what it is about a good audiobook that involves a group of friends going on a retreat in the middle of nowhere, because, you know, that sounds safe and like a good idea. And chaos unfolds and secrets come to light and just drama and suspense and you name it. This book has it. If you have enjoyed any of my other suggestions, such as Shiver or The Swell from Ali Reynolds, you would absolutely love The Long Weekend. So if you are interested in checking out The Long Weekend, or if you just want to let Audible help you discover new ways to laugh or be inspired or be entertained, new members can actually try Audible for free for 30 days. All you have to do is go to audible.com/Danielle or text Danielle to 500-500. And let me know what you are listening to down below so that maybe we can listen together. So now on to the details of today's case. So, Sherrice Iverson was born on October 20th, 1989, to Leroy Iverson and Yolanda Manuel. And according to all accounts from school teachers to friends, Sherrice was an incredibly sweet and loving young child. There was not a time where she didn't have a smile on her face. She didn't have a mean bone in her body. She was rarely in a bad mood. She was just a happy little girl. She attended 75th Street Elementary School in Los Angeles, California, and teachers recall that her father always made sure that she showed up to school on time. He always would neatly press all of her outfits before coming, so girlfriend was dressed to an absolute T, and her beautiful curls were always protected in pristine braids. She loved The Little Mermaid and the color purple and to jump rope, and she had massive dreams for herself. She wanted to be either a nurse or a policewoman or a dancer or a model. Just this long list of goals, and I feel like when you're that age, nothing seems impossible. See, I'm already about to cry, and we're like 2 seconds into the video, you guys. The level of freaking anger is unreal. But seeing this happy-go-lucky, life-loving 7-year-old girl who always had a smile on her face, you would never really know that her home life was not necessarily the easiest. So Leroy, her father, was a retired bus driver. He was 58 years old, and at the time, his health was very rapidly declining. He had very high blood pressure, diabetes. He walked with a cane. He struggled with asthma. He dealt with emphysema that required occasional oxygen. So he was not doing the best. And he also had a pretty rough history, losing 3 children and the mother of one of those children between the years of 1986 and 1993. So there's just a lot going on within this family. His first child died only 2 months old in 1986. This was labeled, I believe, as SIDS being the cause of death. In 1988, he lost a second child due to respiratory failure, and the mother of this child actually died while giving birth. So he was coming off a bunch of loss, a bunch of devastation, and around this time ended up meeting Yolanda. To be quite upfront, there was a massive age gap. Yolanda was 15 years old. So just wanted to get that out of the way. Leroy at the time was 45. And so I don't know how on earth that came about. But at the time, Leroy was a single father to a little boy named Harold, and he met 15-year-old Yolanda, and I guess they hit it off. And so by the age of 16, Yolanda ended up moving in with Leroy. And so they're full on into their relationship, and ultimately, at the age of 16, Yolanda becomes pregnant with Sherrice. So Yolanda drops out of school, is like full-time at home, trying to take care of children. And then the age gap ended up totally destroying their relationship. The home life was very complicated for Sherrice growing up from the moment that she was born. Once she was a few years old, I don't believe Yolanda and Leroy really were doing great at all. They were not sleeping in the same room. Yolanda and Sherrice would sleep in the bedroom and Leroy would sleep on the couch. I mean, they didn't even share the same refrigerator. 1993, a third child ended up being lost when Sherrice was just a few years old. Now, this boy, his name was Jonathan, was 17 months old, and he ended up dying from brain swelling caused by meningitis. And this actually ended up triggering a probe, an investigation into the family, because this 17-month-old boy had also shown up in the ER just weeks prior to his death with very severe burns on his hands. And so there was this speculation around the family that there could potentially be some sort of abuse. When you lose that many children and, all these things, those questions are going to arise. And ultimately, over the course of the next 10 months, at that point, it was just Yolanda and Leroy, Sherrice, and the older brother, Harold. And social workers ended up coming to the home over 58 times, okay? The goal in those situations is always to educate, offer resources, keep the family together. And after that 10 months, they basically decided, this family's doing their best. We think they've progressed. We found absolutely no signs whatsoever of abuse, and so no charges were ever pressed, and they kind of went on about their own way. But there were still issues within the relationship, and I don't know all of the details. I just know that 2 weeks prior to Sherrice's death, Yolanda ended up moving out and in with her sister, and there had been accusations at some point from Leroy that she was an alcoholic and that she smashed his windows, and again, just a tricky situation. When she moved out, Leroy ended up basically having full custody, whether it was granted to him or he just made that decision himself, I'm unsure, of both Harold and Sherrice. And Sherrice at the time was 7, Harold was 14. However, Yolanda was going through the courts at the time to get full custody. Before that could ever happen, before Yolanda ever got a chance to try to get full custody of her daughter, Sherrice was ripped away from her family, brutally ripped away from her family and her future. So on May 24th, 1997, Sherrice and Harold ended up loading up into their father's white Dodge van around 8 p.m. that night to head off from their home in Los Angeles to Primm, Nevada, which is right on the California-Nevada state line. This particular weekend was Memorial Day weekend, so everyone already had off, but I believe Sherrice was actually in year-round school. She'd already been off for a couple of weeks. She was about to go back to school. It was kind of like a last hurrah sort of thing, but mainly Leroy wanted to gamble. And they apparently left so late at night to avoid all of the holiday traffic, understandably. Now, according to Leroy's brother, Leroy had quite a bad case of gambling fever. And so it had become a tradition of sorts for Leroy, Harold, and Sherrice to take these trips for Leroy to go and gamble. I don't really think it was centered around the children and them having fun, but regardless, that was their plan. Head to Primm, Nevada. Now, Primm is about 40 to 50 miles, I believe, just outside of Las Vegas. There's only 3 casinos in the area. When I first saw an image of it, I was like, this is the most random thing dropped in the middle of nowhere. But it was smaller. It's a lot less expensive. There's more things that technically cater to children. There's like a Ferris wheel and roller coasters. It's just a more affordable, more chill version of Las Vegas, like a lot more manageable, especially if you're going to be bringing your children along, I guess. So the trio ended up arriving at this strip of casinos that sit along Interstate 15 at around midnight that night. So this is a Saturday night going into a Sunday. Now, some reports state that when the trio arrived, that they didn't start their night at the Prima Donna Resort and Casino, but they actually started at one of the other 2 casinos. However, I've not been able to get a confirmed location, but they possibly started at Buffalo Bill's or Whiskey Pete's, but ultimately ended up being kicked out because Leroy was failing to watch his children, which is going to be a theme for the entirety of this early morning. So ultimately, sometime around 1 a.m., the 3 ended up at the Prima Donna Resort and Casino. Now, the Prima Donna, out of the 3, seemed to be like the fanciest. It just like looks a lot nicer, more high-end. So Leroy claimed that he felt a lot safer here. According to different articles, Leroy was like a helicopter parent a lot of the time. He wouldn't even let the kids play outside of their home back in Los Angeles because he thought it was an incredibly dangerous situation. But apparently when he walked into this nice resort and casino, someplace where they've got lots of security guards, lots of security cameras, he felt that his children were going to be safe. So he ended up handing both of the kids $5 and sent them off to the arcade so that he could go and gamble on his own. And Harold, the 14-year-old, was put in charge of his 7-year-old sister, Sherrice. But by 1:33 a.m., so not even that long after they had arrived, there were already problems. So hotel security had ended up noticing that Sherrice was casually wandering around the casino on her own. And so they went up to her. They're like, are you okay? What are you doing? And ended up sending out a page to the guests saying that there was a 7-year-old little girl that had been by herself and someone needed to come and claim her. And they're expecting the parents to come and probably say, oh, she wandered off, this, that, and the other. But it wasn't even Leroy that ended up showing up, but her 14-year-old brother, Harold. They handed Sherrice over to her brother and went about their night. But shortly after this, Sherrice was noticed for the second time wandering around by herself. At this point, Prima Donna Casino staff ended up taking her directly to Leroy and telling him that he either needed to watch his children or he needed to leave. But this wasn't at all something that Leroy was going to do. So Leroy had driven the entire group of them all the way to Primm, Nevada, and they didn't have a room to stay in. There seemed to be no intention to get a hotel room. He said that he didn't have the money to get one, so I guess he instead used that money to gamble. So the plan the entire time was for him to gamble all night long into the early morning hours while the children entertained themselves in the arcade, which, by the way, He was even lucky the arcade was open because typically it closed at midnight for safety purposes for children. But because it was a holiday weekend, they decided to keep it open. And so leaving wasn't an option because they didn't drive all the way there for nothing. And watching them was also not an option because Leroy fully intended on gambling. But legally, children are not allowed on the casino floor. So instead of doing exactly what staff had told him and telling them that he was going to leave, he took both children back to the arcade and told them again to stay put. But it only took a little while for Leroy's gambling to be interrupted again. At 2:45 a.m., Sherrice was found passed out asleep on a chair in the casino. This poor 7-year-old girl was probably absolutely exhausted. And so they woke her up and took her back to her father again, and at this point told him that he needed to leave the casino. They're like, "You're not watching your daughter. You know, who knows where your son is? You need to go." But instead, Leroy again simply dropped Sherrice off at the arcade and told her to stay put and disappeared off into the casino to gamble. Now, according to reports from staff, Leroy repeatedly got angry with Harold for not properly watching his sister. And at one point, he'd even been seen clenching his fists and yelling at Harold, saying, quote, "I ought to murder you," because Harold had not been watching her, and it led to Leroy getting a good talking to from the staff. As you can see, gambling was just really taking over this night and taking priority over the safety of these children. And it wasn't until shortly before or right around 5 a.m. that Leroy went to check on both Sherrice and Harold. Now, I have seen it stated in one article that Harold claimed Leroy checked on them every 20 minutes. However, I will state that this article that I got that information from is not one that I trust. I trust it as far as I can throw it. And seeing that it is not a physical entity that I can throw, I basically can't throw it at all. And based on the information that we have, he was with her at 2:45, and there's no way that he checked on her between that time and 5 a.m. Harold is there, but Sherrice is nowhere to be found. And when Leroy asked Harold, where's Sherrice? Harold had no idea. So Leroy immediately ran to the nearest security guard and told them that his daughter was missing. And pretty much most of the casino staff at this point was probably aware of who Sherrice was, just from having to repeatedly get her throughout the early morning hours. And so a search began. Leroy was running around the casino screaming out for Sherrice, but it was to no avail. And finally, at around 5:30, Leroy asked one of the female staff at the casino to go and check the arcade bathroom, the female arcade bathroom, just in case she was in there, because that wasn't somewhere that he could go. And within moments, this female employee ran out in hysterics and pulled Leroy into the bathroom. Sherrice had been found in the handicapped stall of the bathroom, and she had been stripped down and was positioned sitting on the toilet with her feet in the bowl, as if someone did not want anyone to see that anyone was in that stall, wouldn't try to open it, and she had very clearly been murdered. Now, both Leroy and the staff member made repeated attempts to revive Sherrice out of desperation, but at this point, it was already way too late. Right away, Metro Police Department arrived on scene and cordoned off the entire bathroom to start an investigation. And while they didn't believe at the time that Leroy was somehow involved, he was seen by multiple staff remaining in the casino the entirety of the night, there was still this lingering question of why on earth did you leave your children, your 2 young children, unattended in the middle of a casino? And Leroy ended up explaining to police that he was wary of babysitters. And so he preferred to bring his children with him when he went places, even if that meant a casino. And he actually lashed out at the casino, saying that he was blaming them for his daughter's death, saying, quote, "They're responsible for my daughter's killing. They advertise for children. You go down there thinking your children will be safe. You can't watch your children 24 hours a day." And he even told police that he had done this multiple times in the past with no issues. Sherrice's face flooded the news, and a temporary wall was constructed to make sure that the bathroom where this tragedy occurred was untouched and investigators could work properly. Over the following days, everyone, as I'm sure you can assume, had an opinion and was up in arms. It was actually very interesting researching into this case because I go through as many old newspapers as I can, and I totally forgotten about the opinions people could write into newspapers and be published, the little paragraphs. I feel like it's just the equivalent of what we have modern day of Facebook rants and like next door complaints. But it was just like post after post after post in the newspaper of people completely bashing Leroy and saying that his negligence as a parent led to his daughter's death. And so a lot of people were hoping that there would be some charges against Leroy. And it didn't help when casino staff began to speak to different newspapers and ended up telling the Los Angeles Times that just after his daughter's death, he essentially tried to bribe the hotel. So according to the source that spoke to the Los Angeles Times, Leroy came up to them almost immediately after Sherrice was found dead and basically said, if you don't want to be sued, you need to give me beer, $100, a room for the night, you need to pay for Sherrice's funeral, and you need to fly Yolanda out here for the investigation. The source said, quote, what stunned everyone was his total lack of emotion, his total lack of shock that his daughter had been killed. Leroy at this point immediately got a lawyer and commented back saying that he was not a bad parent, that he took very good care of his children, and that he had never said any of this, that the hotel was basically making all of this up and he was absolutely infuriated. He was still placing blame on the casino. Now, equally, others were expressing their shock that the casino staff repeatedly saw this young girl on her own, saw Sherrice just wandering around the casino, and continued to simply return her to Leroy or her brother, when it was very obvious after multiple times of doing this that she was not going to be properly watched. And so many people felt that this murder could have been prevented on a multitude of levels. Sergeant Ralph Hemington of the Metro Police Department Juvenile Division also noted and spoke to newspapers stating that when a child is found around the strip, that typically the first attempt made is to locate the parent and return the child. And that if that doesn't happen, they actually immediately book children into a juvenile facility. And it's not because they've done anything wrong, but it's for their own safety, because the strip is just simply not a safe place to be when you are a minor, especially when you're a very young child. And Clark County officials essentially echoed this, saying that they had a curfew that prevented children under 18 years old from being in public places in the area, I think after 10 p.m. And then specifically on the strip, it was 9 p.m. And they said that that included all of the casinos, that inside of the casinos, even all of the kids, unless they are with a parent, should not be out wandering about. But with that being said, police also had to admit that they simply didn't have the resources to patrol the casinos and ensure that all of these different laws and rules were being followed. Essentially, it was all up to the casinos to make the right choices to ensure that no curfews are being broken, that there weren't children that were in danger, but honestly, what casino is genuinely going to do anything that could prevent themselves from making money? And so this ended up casting a huge eye over all of these large hotel companies and their policies, because I feel like when you're on vacation or you're going to a casino or a hotel or a resort or something, there is this like false sense of security that we all have. I remember having it as a child. I'm like, oh, but this is a vacation. Like, I'm at a hotel, I'm safe. I can walk around by myself. I can go swimming by myself. I can go and get breakfast by myself. And I was like, at her age, like 7, 8, 9 years old. And I'm honestly not sure why that's a thing. I think it's just this mindset of, I'm on vacation, I shouldn't have to be worried about anything. And so you convince yourself that you don't need to be, but you can see how all of these people, parents, families, you name it, had these questions after this saying, are we actually safe in these places? Like, should we trust the security that's in place, the rules that are in place? Is everything being followed? Is there a proper protocol? And so a lot of other massive hotels were asked about their current level of security involving children, involving these families, and they declined to comment. And so you can imagine that people were like, what are you hiding? So I feel like this was a huge eye-opener that was very much needed for a lot of people that so blindly trusted that simply because they were at a hotel or on vacation and they were supposed to be having fun, that made them immune to anything like this happening to them. So despite all of these claims and accusations against the prima donna from not just the public, but Leroy and Yolanda, they decided to offer a $10,000 reward for any information at all that would ultimately help solve the case. Other casino executives, however, did decide to weigh in their opinion. Alan Feldman from the Mirage Resort said, quote, everyone's security measures in these kinds of places count on the parents acting in a responsible and appropriate way and supervising their children. The arcades are not a place to leave a child alone, and that's not what the overwhelming number of our guests do. In response to this uproar, Metro Police Department Lieutenant Wayne Peterson ended up having to state that he was not in a position at the moment to really comment on the culpability of either the hotel, casino, or Leroy. There were all these people that wanted action like right then, right there about these particular things. And he had to say, that is not my focus. Like, our focus right now is that a 7-year-old child has been brutally murdered and stuffed into a toilet. However, it was followed up with, if there comes a point where we are concerned about Leroy, that is something that will be dealt with. If there is a point where the security or, things within the hotel protocols are questioned, that is something that will be dealt with. But the point of utmost concern was finding out who did this to Sherrice. And that following Tuesday, May the 28th, police ended up reaching out to the public for assistance. Security cameras had captured Sherrice's final moments, and not just that, it captured who possibly did this to her. Staff at the Prima Donna had worked tirelessly this entire time to gather as much footage as possible from their many surveillance cameras to hand over to the investigating agency. Cameras in the casino were able to confirm that Sherrice had been left unattended from roughly 1 a.m. to just before 4 in the morning. Leroy had actually told police and the casino that they had been there with a handful of other adults and some older children, and they were watching as well. But the casino was able to watch their entire journey that night from the car all the way to inside, and they were not with anybody else. Sherrice was in fact alone apart from her brother, who had spent a lot of the night off with children his own age. So at around 3 a.m., just after that third and final time that Sherrice was taken back to the arcade by her father, Sherrice was seen playing around with another boy her age. According to police, and this is something that's so wildly shocking, when they were looking at this footage of Sherrice, her final hour, where they knew where she was, they counted over 40 children unattended in the arcade at 3 in the morning, to just show you like the magnitude of this problem. Sherrice was playing for a while, and then she was last seen walking out of camera's view at 3:45 a.m. heading towards the bathrooms in the arcade. Now, 15 seconds, I believe, after she walked in there, a white male in his late teens to early 20s follows behind her. And based on the camera's positioning, they were not able to confirm which restroom either individual went into. You couldn't see any of that. So it's not like they knew for a fact that he followed in behind her. But what was telling to them was the length of time that this individual spent in the bathroom. So after this first male went into the bathroom, another male around the same age followed in suit. And they were able to confirm that both of these males had been together the entire night in the casino and in the arcade. Now, the second male was in the bathroom area for just under 2 minutes. It was like 1 minute and 56 seconds or something like that. And when he exited the bathroom, he is seen just like hanging out around this hallway entrance to the bathroom area. And police said that they weren't sure if he was possibly just waiting for his friend to come out, or if maybe he was standing guard. They couldn't even say if this guy knew for sure what was going on in the bathroom. They believed that these two individuals were very possibly involved, because the first male would not emerge from the bathroom for 24 minutes, walking out casually as if nothing had happened. But after this, Sherrice never comes out. Now, according to authorities, within those 24 minutes, there were multiple women that went in and out of the bathroom. From the way that it's described, they were able to speak to these individuals, and none of them reported hearing or seeing anything strange in the bathroom. While they didn't hear or see anything strange, police were fairly certain at this point that just behind that closed stall door, Sherrice was being murdered. Investigators told the public that these two young men were seen on camera the entire night together, that one of them was repeatedly showing off his nipple rings and his tongue piercing, and that over the course of the night, he and this friend that only stayed in the bathroom for about 2 minutes chatted up a handful of different teenage girls throughout the casino. And so authorities were able to locate these individuals and speak to them, hoping that they could gather some sort of information. Now, most of these young women actually claimed to be very creeped out by both of these two young males. To the point they had given them false information in order to just get them to leave them alone, like false numbers, false addresses, you name it. But thankfully, these two young men seemed to be very open about themselves to these young women. And so authorities were able to figure out that both of these young men said they were from Long Beach, California, and had even mentioned to one of them that they attended Woodrow Wilson High School. So this gave police a massive head start when it came to searching. Now, the first male was described as having dark hair. He was wearing a backwards baseball cap with a logo that they couldn't really identify. He was also wearing a dark t-shirt and a light pair of shorts. And this was the first male that spent 24 minutes in the restroom with nipple piercings and a tongue ring. Now, the second male that had gone in afterwards and only stayed 2 minutes was described as having dark hair with very distinct sideburns. He also was wearing a pair of shorts and a dark button-up short sleeve shirt. By early that Tuesday, this still shot of these two individuals was circulated all over the news from Prim all the way to Long Beach, California, with the hopes that someone there would recognize them and call in to give authorities their identity. And that pretty much happened right away. Very quickly, police were able to identify both of these men as being 18-year-old David Cash Jr. This was the individual that had been in the bathroom for those 2 minutes, and then 18-year-old Jeremy Strohmeyer, the one who was in there for 24 minutes. Give you an idea of Jeremy, the main person they're looking into to see how we got from point A to point B, how this even happened. Here's a brief history on him. So Jeremy Strohmeyer had been adopted when he was 18 months old by Winnie and John Strohmeyer, a very well-off couple that had one daughter of their own already, and it seemed that from very early on in their relationship, they always knew they wanted to have one biological child and adopt a second one. And so they didn't end up knowing much at all about Jeremy's history, according to what they've said, in terms of his biological parents when they initially adopted him. But at that point in time, it didn't matter. They saw this beautiful blue-eyed boy who needed a family, and so they brought him in. Now, Jeremy was raised his entire life pretty much in Southern California. He didn't want for anything. His family owned their own personal airplane, was able to get his flying license. He had plans of enlisting in the Air Force, and he, for a majority of his life, was described by those that knew him, from teachers to his family to friends, as being this incredibly intelligent young man that was just beautifully well raised, a shining star example of a well-rounded citizen. But something seemed to just kind of like flip 2 years prior to Sherrice's murder. So at this point in time, I believe he was in like the 10th grade, about to go into the 11th grade. The Strohmeyers ended up relocating to Singapore for his mother's job. And they kind of viewed this as a great opportunity for the family. They thought this would be a lot of fun, but it ended up being the exact opposite, because for one reason or another, Jeremy ended up falling downhill, making very, very bad decisions. So all of a sudden in Singapore, Jeremy started to drink. His family stated that he would frequently come home with alcohol on his breath, and he would go out and party on a regular basis, and they seemed to not be able to stop him. He seemed to just genuinely not care that he was doing unacceptable things, being like a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, and he just continued them. He also started to become very defiant against his mother in particular, which took them all by surprise, because his entire life he had always loved his mom. He doted on her. He would give her little gifts. He was basically a big mama's boy, and so this very drastic shift in their relationship was very jarring to them and very telling that something had to kind of be going on. Ultimately, even the school that he had been attending in Singapore refused to enroll him for another year because of his behavior. They said that he was showing up high to school. Strohmeyers decided to move back to Long Beach. Maybe this change caused a problem, and so Jeremy ended up going back to Woodrow Wilson High School for, I believe it was like his junior year into his senior year. I couldn't quite figure out the timing on everything. So at this point, I believe his family likely hoped that this behavior would change, but ultimately it just continued and worsened. Pretty quickly, Jeremy landed himself with a DUI. He had a suspended license. And then when he turned 18, all hell broke loose. He essentially threw what little bit of caution he had to the wind. He began to party even more constantly, and not just party. Like, this isn't just a situation where he was using drugs and drinking and not making the best decisions that only affected him. Like, he was doing a lot of things that were a huge harm to others, that were devastating to others. There were many rumors swirling around and stories that were told about him smashing people's belongings at parties and putting holes in walls. There was one story of him stealing the host's kitten, and then while leaving, he threw the kitten out of the car. He also ended up in a relationship with a young woman named Agnes, and that apparently just sent him even deeper into bad decisions. They would heavily drink together, they would party a lot. And according to Jeremy, she played a pretty big role in his final spiral. According to Agnes, quote, he tried to hurt himself and eventually hurt other people and get into fights over nothing when he's drunk or when he's agitated and extremely angry. And she even made claims later on to police that he had hit her at times while drinking. And so his behavior is beyond just a rebellious teenager. He is a danger to himself. He is a danger to those around him. Now, all of this behavior ultimately ended with him being kicked out of his house. And so he ended up moving in with a good friend of his and David's, the other individual police had identified. And this young man's name was Jeremy Phillips. Now, Jeremy had already graduated. He was living off on his own, and essentially, this was just adding more fuel to the fire, so to speak. Living with Jeremy Phillips gave Jeremy Strohmeyer that much more freedom. He essentially had nobody watching after him. His good grades in school, which, by the way, he was incredibly intelligent, like had a 3-point-something GPA, like 3.7 or 3.8 GPA. He was on sports teams, like he was an incredibly intelligent student. All of that began to slip. He started to skip classes. He quit the team. He quit the volleyball team. All of these different things. And instead, basically, Jeremy Strohmeyer, Jeremy Phillips, and David Cash Jr. spent their time just absolutely wreaking havoc in Long Beach. So if they weren't getting drunk or high or using some sort of drugs, they were driving along the PCH, harassing sex workers. They were harassing transients. According to Jeremy Phillips, they basically did whatever they could to harass, quote, lower forms of life. They would smash eggs in sex workers' faces. They would shoot BB guns at people. And to them, they thought this was absolutely hilarious. And Jeremy Phillips even recalled a time where Jeremy Strohmeyer went out on his own or with other friends and came back to the apartment giddy. And when Jeremy Phillips asked him what he had done, Jeremy Strohmeyer explained that he went out and lured a sex worker over to the car and grabbed her by her arm and told the driver to speed off. He dragged this sex worker alongside a speeding vehicle for an extended distance. And he said that he had come up with this new thing called, quote, whore dragging. I have seen a lot in my life, okay? I was a very rebellious teenager that made not good decisions. This is so far beyond that. This is not just making bad decisions, which unfortunately, to this day, Jeremy Strohmeyer is trying to claim that that's all this is. Just a teenager making bad decisions. So eventually, Jeremy Phillips had to move away. He wanted to move away to Oregon, and so Jeremy Strohmeyer had nowhere to go. And so he ended up back at his parents' house. And this was not something that he seemingly enjoyed because his parents had put on a whole new slew of rules to try to stop this behavior. And so he had a lot of his freedoms that he saw being taken away. This Agnes girl that he was head over heels with, he said was the only person who understood him, who basically encouraged all of this behavior from what it seems, was losing interest in him, and he ended up spiraling. And this led to even more drug use. He was heavily using speed. It was a bad situation. Now, he and David at this point became very close, and David was described by friends as a, quote, arrogant nerd. He was the kind of person that thought he was better than you, that he knew more than you. He was incredibly intelligent, and he used that against pretty much everyone, according to what friends have described. And so they were just this horrible concoction that led to pushing any and all boundaries. They got their tongues pierced together, they crashed David's mom's car, and ultimately they went to this casino, and again, this chaos followed them. So just a few weeks prior to the murder of Sherrice, Jeremy's family asked him to go and seek therapy, like to try to figure out what was going on, because this abrupt change in behavior, like quite literally, according to one of his teachers, he went from being like the top 1% of good kids and students to what I just described just now. They felt there had to be something more going on here. Like there was something mentally, psychologically, they wanted to get to the bottom of it. And so Jeremy agreed to go see a therapist. And ultimately, he ended up being diagnosed with ADHD. Everyone's favorite scapegoat diagnosis. What do you do when a teenager or young child comes in with, bad behavior? Gotta be ADHD. There can be no other explanation. And so essentially they prescribed him a medicine called Dexedrine, which is an amphetamine. Literally gave a guy already dependent on speed an amphetamine and sent him on his way. Now, I don't think they knew that, but regardless, it just doesn't seem that this small opportunity where he could have received some sort of help led to anything other than enabling. And I'm sure at this point in time, he thought this was absolutely great, because based on Jeremy's own recollections of all of this, he has his own blog that I have linked down below. He basically started using Dexedrine as like this buffer when he couldn't afford speed or couldn't get his hands on it. So this was not helping him whatsoever the way that his family was hoping that it would. So the young man that had once been seen as this top student, this top individual in general, was going to enlist in the Air Force, had tumbled into a life of disaster and was now the center of the murder of a 7-year-old. And everyone was trying to figure out how on earth all of this happened. So when police had released this photograph, what ultimately ended up happening is that they right away started to receive concerned phone calls from students at this high school, from parents. Jeremy had gone to school that day, and David had decided to totally skip classes. And I guess throughout the day, Jeremy ended up being confronted by a handful of students who had seen this photograph, and they were like, dude, we know for a fact this is you. Despite being confronted by all of his peers, Jeremy was, for the most part, repeatedly denying that it was him, that he had anything to do with it, but nobody was convinced. And so a handful of these students had actually gone to the principal earlier that morning to express their concerns. And so the principal then called the police. The police came to the school, and they were able to essentially confirm the identity of this one individual in the picture. But not just did they have these multiple calls from concerned students and parents, David Cash Jr., the one individual in this still shot, the young man that had been in the bathroom for 2 minutes, ended up ultimately turning himself in after being faced with the photograph by his father, who had apparently taken both boys to the Prima Donna Resort that night that they were photographed there. And so David had a mugshot taken, he was questioned by police, and he essentially told them this entire huge story about what had happened and implicated his friend, Jeremy Strohmeyer, in the process. So within a few hours, police were tracking down Jeremy. They had people at his home, and he ended up being arrested. Surveillance was sitting outside of the Strohmeyer home, and they were keeping an eye on Jeremy. He was outside, he was slowly smoking a cigarette, and eventually he went back inside. Now, shortly after this, his sister pulls up into the driveway in her BMW, and out comes his mom. And as soon as his mom walks in this front door, Jeremy is seen booking it through the backyard, out of a garden door, and down the road. And so right away, he is followed by authorities and arrested. Now, while this is going on, they start hearing these screams for help from what appears to be his mother. She ends up explaining to police that she had just walked into the home, which they already knew because they were watching, and she found that the door was unlocked, which was odd, and as she entered, she smelled the smell of smoke, which also was strange to her, so she immediately went to try to find Jeremy, who should have been at home, but instead of finding him, she found a note that essentially was a goodbye note, along with an empty bottle of his Dexedrine, and she said that he had at least taken 37 pills. Right away, instead of taking Jeremy to the police department to be able to question him, they had to take him to the hospital to have his stomach pumped. Now, after having his stomach pumped, after settling in the hospital in recovery before being released, apparently without much prompting at all, he began to confess to Officer James Vaquero and Phil Ramos. He said that he had sexually assaulted and killed Sherrice Iverson. Now, he immediately, once he was stable enough, was transferred to the Long Beach Police Department, where he confessed 2 more times. All of this was recorded, and the story that both of these men combined, both David Cash and Jeremy Strohmeyer, told was absolutely gut-wrenching and devastating. Jeremy, David Jr., and David Sr. had taken that Memorial Day weekend to go on a trip to Las Vegas. And so on their way to Las Vegas for this fun guys weekend, they decided to make a pit stop in Primm. David Sr. told both Jeremy and David Jr. that he was probably just going to gamble till about 3 a.m. They could go off, have fun, do whatever they wanted, and then they would finish their trip to Las Vegas, which wouldn't be anything too crazy. So as David Sr. gambled, both Jeremy and David Jr. were off doing whatever the heck they wished. Now, Jeremy Strohmeyer just so happened to have a fake ID, so he was using this to buy all sorts of drinks for himself. He was buying like Jack and Cokes and beers, so he was already into his drinking that he so regularly did. And while it seemed to be fun at first for both of them, they very clearly got bored because they decided, hey, what better way to spend our time than to piss into a few of the arcade games? So they made their way to the arcade, caused a little bit of trouble there, and at that point, they started to talk up a handful of girls. And Jeremy ended up trying to get the number of a 16-year-old girl that he met in the arcade, and it was at this time that he ended up being hit with a wadded up wet paper towel. And there was 7-year-old Sherrice at just around 3 a.m. when she was captured on security footage playing with this other little boy her age. Now, Sherrice and this little boy had been throwing these wet wadded up paper towels at each other back and forth for a while, and one of these had accidentally hit Jeremy, and he didn't get angry or anything, but he said that he went on to instead play with Sherrice, that he started throwing these paper towels back at her, and ultimately it turned into like this weird game of hide and seek. Now, according to Jeremy, he ended up telling Sherrice after a while that the only place he could hide from her where he wasn't going to find her was going to be the women's restroom. And so ultimately, that is where Sherrice ended up. When Sherrice went into the bathroom, Jeremy followed her. He was basically describing to a T what officers had already seen on the surveillance footage. He claimed that he continued to play with Sherrice while in the bathroom. She was on one end of the bathroom, he was on the other. They continued to toss these wet paper towels, but at one point during this, Sherrice picked up one of the yellow wet floor signs and playfully hit him with it. And according to Jeremy, for some unknown reason, he snapped when this happened. David, in his own interview, had his own recollection of this particular time. From my understanding, everything that they had said up until this point matched, and he said that he also witnessed Jeremy and Sherrice playing back and forth, just like they had been out in the arcade. But he also recalled that at one point, Sherrice picks up this wet floor sign and hits Jeremy with it, and he saw Jeremy snap as well. So after being hit with this sign, according to both Jeremy and David, Jeremy picked Sherrice up and walked her into the handicapped bathroom, locking the stall behind them. At this point, David said he wanted to see what was going on, so he went into the adjacent stall in the bathroom and looked up over the stall to see what was going on. And he ended up seeing Jeremy holding Sherrice forcefully with his hand over her mouth, preventing anyone from hearing her screaming. And David claimed that Jeremy was repeatedly saying, "I am going to kill you." Now, for one reason or another, for reasons that we probably will never ever understand, and David saw this, then proceeded to simply leave the bathroom. He didn't go get help. He did not call for security. He just stood there waiting for Jeremy to be done with whatever he was doing to Sherrice, which he would end up finding out was killing her. At this point, according to Jeremy, he had her in this stall and he explained that he took her boots off, he took her clothing off, all while holding her and holding his hand over her mouth so that nobody could hear her. He admitted that at one point he heard at least 2 women walk into the restroom, and during this, in order for them to not see anything off, he actually leaned up against Sherrice. I don't know if she was on the toilet or if he leaned up against her on the wall and basically put enough pressure on this little girl to where she would stay quiet. And ultimately, it was enough pressure to have her fall unconscious. At this point, he told police that he came to the realization that she would be able to identify him, Sherrice would know who he was, things had basically gone too far, and so he made the decision to kill her. Just that. It wasn't just this, oh, I had no other option. He flat out told police that he wanted to experience death. So he proceeded to strangle Sherrice. As if that's not absolutely awful and tragic enough, according to Jeremy, she was still breathing. So he grabbed her head and proceeded to snap her neck. After hearing an audible pop, she was still making noises, so he still had not killed her, and so he did it again. He snapped her neck for a second time. What Sherrice probably experienced in those last few minutes of her life is incomprehensible. No person, let alone a 7-year-old, should ever experience something like that. David claimed that after these 24 minutes were up, Jeremy came out of the bathroom, again, incredibly casual, and looked at David and said, "I killed her." At this point, both individuals, again, instead of getting help, instead of acknowledging what had happened, instead of doing anything, they simply went to find David Sr., hopped in the car, and drove to Las Vegas. These 2 young men, knowing what they knew, and after doing what he did, spent the rest of the weekend riding roller coasters, playing slot machines, having the time of their lives. They decided to make a pact that they would not ever tell anyone what had happened. Jeremy seemed to not even think that he would ever be caught. There were surveillance cameras there. David, I guess, saw that there were surveillance cameras there. And Jeremy said, oh, they're probably not working. They never thought that anyone would care about this little girl enough for anything to be done. And they also said that they were, too far away. They weren't even from out of town. There seemed to be no thought in their mind that, first of all, anything that was done was wrong. And second of all, that they would ever have to answer for it. But just in case they did, they also figured out what they were going to say to police. They were going to tell police that they had in fact been playing with Sherrice, and that when they went into the bathroom to play with her, that essentially she, for some reason, unknown to them, decided to lock herself in a bathroom stall. And so they didn't touch her after that. They didn't mess with her after that. They didn't harm her, that they simply just left. And they even joked about Jeremy pleading insanity or blaming the alcohol that he had drank that night. All of these different things. I mean, they fully thought out what they were going to do. Turned out that not just had these 2 young men been harboring this information, but they had actually told multiple people about it. Forget the pact, they had told handfuls of individuals, of close friends of theirs. When this photo began circulating, David was actually the first of the 2 to see it. He had stayed home, he saw it on the 5 o'clock news and immediately panicked. So he went over to Jeremy's house to tell him, hey, look, hate to break it to you, those cameras were working and they caught us, and now our face is plastered on the news all the way back home in Long Beach. And they decided, we've got to confide in someone. So they ended up meeting a man named James Trujillo, one of their friends, to ultimately tell him what had happened. After explaining to them what had been done to Sherrice, they then went on to ask him to watch the news and let them know if he thought that the photo resembled them. It was basically like, oh, well, do you think anyone's going to recognize us kind of thing? And off they went. Now, police ultimately ended up bringing in James Trujillo to question him about this. And he said that when both David and Jeremy approached him and spoke to him about this and confessed that Jeremy had killed this little girl, that he didn't even believe it. He said that Jeremy was just the kind of person that would do the absolute most for attention. And so he genuinely believed that this was one of those times that Jeremy just wanted attention. And so he was stirring up the pot. He never believed for a moment that Jeremy had actually harmed anyone. But again, that wasn't the only person that they told. David ended up, after confiding in James, going on his own to call Jeremy Phillips, their really good friend. It seems to me, based on all of this, that David was just ready to go, man. He wanted to tell absolutely everybody he could. And while Jeremy did confess to a handful of people, he seemed a lot less concerned or bothered or driven to tell anyone about what he had done. So anyways, David called Jeremy Phillips and said, hey, have you seen us up there in Oregon on the news yet? Like, it's just an accomplishment. And then goes on to tell Jeremy Phillips what had happened. And Jeremy Phillips is just in absolute disbelief and shock. And the first thing that he tells David is that David has to turn in Jeremy Strohmeyer. He's like, what happened is wrong. You've got to turn him in. But David had absolutely no interest in doing that. He's like, no, I'm not turning him in. He's my friend. And ultimately, Jeremy Phillips, who had the opportunity at this point to go to police, also chose to not go to them. And when police went to him asking him why, he said, oh, it's just a guy thing. When I told you there was a fire of anger burning inside of me, this is why. This is why. There is no guy code that you protect your friends if they murder somebody. Another friend, Justin Ware, ended up getting home late that Tuesday night to his mom being absolutely beside herself. Now, Justin Ware was one of Jeremy's really close friends. He spent a lot of time over there. This is actually the first place that he went after his parents kicked him out, because Justin Ware's mom was essentially like his second mom. And the moment she saw this photograph on the news, she was like, oh my goodness, what has happened? And so she sat down her son to look at this photograph with her, and sure as all get out, Justin said it looked like Jeremy, but he did not want to say that in front of his mother. He basically went into a full panic. So he right away went to his bedroom and called Jeremy to ask him what on earth was going on. Now, according to Justin, originally Jeremy denied having anything to do with it, just like he denied it to multiple people that confronted him at school. But ultimately, the following day, that Wednesday, Jeremy and David showed up to school that morning in David's mom's convertible, with the daily newspaper just spread out wide in the seat of the car, with their picture and a picture of Sherrice right there. Like, they were proud of it. They had gone to like collect this newspaper that they were in. And at this point, Justin confronted Jeremy again and said, did you do this? And he said, yeah, I strangled this girl. Jeremy also spent time with yet another friend. So another person that knew about this. And this individual was Jordan Wheeler. And Jordan basically confronted Jeremy, asked about the surveillance footage, and Jeremy didn't even attempt to conceal it or anything. At this point, he just very casually said, yes, I strangled Sherrice. And Jordan later on went to speak to police. He said that right away, quote, I believed him. Someone doesn't make that stuff up. It wasn't like he was remorseful. So there was just this total attitude of nonchalance that even their best friends picked up on. And everyone, I think, was just so shocked and beside themselves that they didn't even know what to do. And not a single one of them, for the most part, reported anything to authorities until they were brought in for questioning, except for Jeremy's ex-girlfriend. So Jeremy's ex-girlfriend, Agnes, he also had confessed to. However, this is kind of an interesting situation because it brought in a very different and new element. While Jeremy had told those he confessed to that he strangled this girl, he had admitted to them that he murdered her. Everything David was saying said that Jeremy murdered her. At this point in time, Jeremy told Agnes that yes, he murdered her, but David sexually assaulted her. And this was the only person that had been told this information. And Agnes stated that initially she also did not believe what was being told to her. She thought that this was just like another one of Jeremy's attempts to get her attention. So she brushed this off until right after this, she ended up seeing the photograph herself and right away was like, oh my goodness, that's for sure Jeremy. And so she called him, and her advice, honestly, was a little bit strange, if I'm just gonna be very blunt. She called him and was like, if this is you, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. And she never encouraged him to turn himself in. She was just like, you should tell your parents, flee the country and see a priest. So like just very bizarre advice being given out here. Jeremy told her, yes, I did do this, and tried to convince her to leave the country with him, saying that he wanted to flee, he wanted them both to just run away. And so ultimately, Agnes ended up calling her father and telling him what happened, and her father called the police and said, look, if you're looking for Jeremy Strohmeyer, you need to go get him now because he is going to run. Jeremy admitted that he had asked another friend of his to give him a ride to the airport or to the bus station, that he had packed up an entire bag, but his friend responded to him, quote, Jeremy, you shouldn't get away with this. You should be punished for what you did. No one seemed to have intentions of helping him. They certainly weren't turning him in, but they also weren't helping him. In a statement Jeremy made to police, he said, quote, I panicked because I didn't know what to do. So I was thinking about taking off and getting rid of any evidence I might have or whatnot. So I burned the cap that I was wearing that night and the shorts that I was wearing that night. So he admitted to destroying evidence at this point. And this links up with his mother's statement that when she walked into the house that day, around the time he was arrested, that she smelled of fire burning. He had tried to get rid of whatever he possibly could. Ultimately, with all of this information, knowing what they did, knowing what led to Sherrice's death, Jeremy Strohmeyer ended up being charged for her murder, but David ended up walking away unscathed. He technically, according to the eyes of the law, had not done anything. Now, I don't know at this point if police had gathered any sort of evidence to prove he had not been there, like fingerprints or, whatever, to prove he had not been the one to sexually assault her. But it seems that pretty much right away, they're like, nope, you're fine. Go ahead. You can be free. I've seen none of the commercial airlines would even take Jeremy back to Las Vegas when he was being extradited. Nobody wanted to touch this man with a 20-foot pole. So they ended up having to actually hire like a private plane to take him. And Detective Ramos, who did a lot of the initial investigating, who has spoken to this day that this case has totally messed him up, said that the entire time, like you would assume this would be a very somber experience. But instead of just silence or maybe apologizing for what he did or talking about the crime or just anything that you would expect, the entire flight, Jeremy nonchalantly spoke about his knowledge about the plane they were on. He's like, oh yeah, I know a lot about planes. My parents have a plane and I know how to fly planes and I was going to be in the Air Force. Detective Ramos said after hearing his confessions, his multiple confessions, and hearing the way he spoke when being extradited, he said that he was, quote, mad at God. He talks about it like a high school field trip. There is no emotion. He's just flat monotone. He didn't even get nervous. Despite the fact that Jeremy had now been arrested and was charged with multiple different felonies, including first-degree murder, he didn't seem very worried at all that this was going to ultimately lead to a sentence. I don't know if it's because he had already destroyed any evidence that he would have had on him, but he made multiple statements about looking forward to the following summer, like getting out of jail the next summer. He even spoke about wanting to figure out how to get a new identity once he was out of prison so that he could go about his life and no one would know him for this. Meanwhile, other people are kind of faced with the reality of what is going on while he is in this absolute la-la land. His parents were receiving death threats, blaming them for their son's actions. And so they were dealing with a lot. Sherrice's family is having to plan a funeral for their 7-year-old daughter. No parent should ever, ever outlive their child. And everything to Jeremy and David just seems to be a joke. David, who escaped without any charges, was now trying to make money off the story. Like as much money as he possibly can. David was quoted in interviews just days later and just the following couple years until the trial was supposed to begin, saying, quote, I'm no idiot. I'll get my money out of this. Essentially, David was saying that he was well aware that he had a, quote, good story and that he was planning on selling it for as much money as he could. And he even stated that he had intentions of waiting until he was kind of labeled a key witness in the case during testimony. He wanted to be able to sell his story then, thinking he'd get the most money out of it, you guys. And despite saying he was waiting to get his money, he then turned around and sold a video of him and Jeremy drinking together for $1,500. And it didn't stop there. After all of this occurred, after David turned himself in and then was released, and after Jeremy was arrested, David went back to school. And he even made statements that he was so excited to go back to school just to see what people would say. Both of them had actually seemingly hoped to be arrested on campus, like they wanted to be arrested, like it was some scene out of a movie or something. But ultimately, when David got to school that day, he was told by the principal that he had to leave. He was no longer allowed at school to finish out those last 2 weeks. They said that they were going to mail him his diploma. They said that they were going to reimburse him for his prom ticket. He was not allowed to go because essentially he was like a massive liability. His response to that was that he was going to sue the school. He said, quote, "They deprived me of 2 weeks of education. I figure I'll probably get a couple million off of that." Rage, fire of rage. See what I'm saying now? And it just keeps going. So Jeremy, meanwhile, ended up hiring a very well-known attorney. His family, despite everything that was going on, stuck by his side. They wanted to ensure he had representation. So they hired Leslie Abramson. And Leslie is actually well-known for defending the Menendez brothers. And so there were high hopes that he would be able to essentially toss out his confession at this point. Leslie Abramson claimed that the investigating officers had bullied Jeremy, and not just that, they had intimidated him into giving his confession. Now, the claim was that he was getting his stomach pumped when he gave this first confession. So there's no way that he was coherent, this, that, and the other. And I'm not even going to pretend like when I first saw that I wasn't like, wait a minute, he first confessed in the hospital. Like, didn't he take 37 pills and was getting his stomach pumped? But according to nurses that came forward and testified about this, he was fully aware of what was going on when he confessed. Like, he even admits in his blog that he didn't feel any sort of effects from the medicine until right around the time he was getting his stomach pumped. So once that happened and he was recovering, he was fully mentally aware. That is when he made this confession. But not just that, Leslie Abramson was also claiming that he was denied representation, which would just be a double whammy and would very likely have this confession thrown out. But police and prosecutors were able to prove without a doubt that this was not at all the case. When Jeremy began to confess, they apparently had not even prompted him. He just started to come out with the information while he was fully stable in the hospital. He also denied having counsel, stating that he just wanted to get everything out of the open. The police did read him his Miranda rights. He interrupted, saying, "No, I already know them already." Like, he was very well aware of what was happening. On top of that, they were able to show what his other two confessions stated, and that again, he was read his Miranda rights. He was given the option of representation. All of this was denied, and all of these confessions matched. They were all the same exact story. So at this point, everything was consistent, and Leslie could not find any evidence at all to suggest otherwise apart from Jeremy's words. So ultimately, this did not end up holding up, and the confession continued on. So the defense decided to take up an entirely different strategy and approach, and at this point, essentially wanted to knock down the first-degree murder charges to second-degree murder by claiming that there was absolutely no intent, that he did not walk into the casino that night with full-on plans of attacking a 7-year-old girl, that there was no intention to harm her, that something else had happened along the way, whether it was the drugs that he was on, his medication, or it was the alcohol that he was drinking, but that there was never this intention that night to harm anyone. But the prosecution strongly begged to differ. When they did the search of Jeremy's home, the warrant that they had, they ended up taking his computer. Now, the issue with this was that they had never listed his computer on the warrant. So there was this argument there on if this should be admitted into court. But this computer had hit the motherload of information showing that there was intent there. On Jeremy's computer on May 23rd, just 2 days before Sherrice was murdered, he had signed into an internet chat room under the name Flyboy1030. And at about 9:07 p.m. that night, he had a conversation with someone with the screen name Little Lover. So Little Lover asked, quote, "Do you like girls?" Jeremy responded, quote, "Very much so." Little Lover then said, quote, "Cool. How young do you like them?" To which Jeremy said, quote, "I've never had a chance to try anything, but I fantasize all the time. I don't know, probably about 5 or 6. So within 2 days of the murder of the 7-year-old girl, Jeremy has information on his computer where he specifically is saying that he fantasizes about little girls around 5 or 6 years old and that he had never had a chance to try anything. And so was this him seeing that opportunity? This alone proves intent. But to top it all off, he had downloaded through his emails on his computer over 800 files of explicit images and videos, majority of those being of children. Now, right away, the defense is like, oh, absolutely not. Like, you can't prove this, that, and the other. This computer should not have been taken. It should be out of evidence because it wasn't listed on the warrant. Jeremy also stated that he didn't always know what was in the files that came to him through the emails. And so just because those files were on his computer, like he would have had to download them, unzip them. He arranged them into different files. So he said it was a good chance he didn't even know that those explicit photos and, videos of children were there. However, it's hard to believe that when majority of the 800 said files contained those images and videos of children. And so ultimately, the judge ended up deciding that this evidence was allowed into trial. So the defense's plan to say that he never intended to kill Sherrice, that he had never had plans to do this, were off the table. And so because of that, there was going to be the charge of first-degree murder, which opened up the possibility of the death sentence, execution. And so ultimately, within hours of when his trial was supposed to start, Jeremy agreed to a plea deal. Essentially, he was going to plead guilty in return for getting life sentences instead of possibility of execution. So while that seemed to be coming to an end, there was seemingly justice for the murder of Sherrice. There was still so much chaos happening in the background. During all of this discovery period prior to when the trial was supposed to begin, the Stromeyers ended up finding out information that led to them filing a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles or the county of Los Angeles and the social workers and adoption workers because they ended up discovering, they said, that Jeremy's birth parents both severely struggled with mental health and drug abuse. And according to the Stromeyers, they had very directly stated on all of their files when they were looking for a child to adopt that they did not want to adopt a child that had any sort of history of mental illness. And so they claimed that had they known this information, they would not have adopted Jeremy, or at the very least, they could have been looking out for specific red flags. They would have taken his behavioral change very differently, and it could have potentially prevented the death of Sherrice Iverson. Now, apparently, Jeremy's mother, when she was pregnant with him, was actually being held permanently in a mental hospital. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, also OCD. She also was diagnosed with severe alcoholism, and up to the point that he was born, she had been hospitalized over 60 times for her mental illness. And just prior to being born, it was determined that she was no longer capable of taking care of herself. So she was in a hospital, and Jeremy was born and ultimately put up for adoption. And I didn't see a lot of history about Jeremy's father, but I do know that he was heavily involved in drugs. He also was in prison. And so the Stromeyers were devastated about this. Now, interestingly, from what I have seen, there was actually evidence brought forward that the Stromeyers did in fact know about the mental health situation with his biological parents. I tried very hard to look for an ending to that particular lawsuit, and I couldn't find one. All I saw was that it was discovered there was this letter where it was disclosed, and so I don't know what to believe here. So on top of that, this was not the only lawsuit going on. There were a handful of other lawsuits as well. So Leroy Iverson sued the Prima Donna Resort. Yolanda Manuel sued the Prima Donna Resort. Essentially, the argument was that this casino had different marketing practices to specifically lure in families under this guise of, your children are safe here, you can gamble, your kids can have fun at the arcade, and yada, yada, yada. But then they completely fail to actually protect the children. Leroy specifically also accused the casino of defamation, slander for the accusations and claims that they had put out there, that he had tried to essentially bribe them in order to not sue them directly after his daughter's death. However, I have also not seen any sort of ending with either of those lawsuits, but my gut feeling is that they probably didn't get far with it, because ultimately, as a parent, they have a legal and moral responsibility to their child. So I don't believe that probably went how they were hoping it would. So on October 14th, after agreeing to the plea deal and everything settled, there was the sentencing, and Jeremy was ultimately sentenced to 4 life terms without the possibility of parole. I have seen that one of them made it so where he'd possibly get parole, I believe, after like 70 or 75 years or something. But I've also seen it the other way. So again, that's a bit of information I can't confirm. However, this brings me to possibly the most angry that I've ever been during a case. At the sentencing, Jeremy wrote a 22-some page letter to read out loud. And I've read the entire thing. I have a link to it down below. I'm not going to read it here just because it's so incredibly long and you have to read the whole thing to understand why, in my opinion, it is so awful. But essentially, Jeremy seems to have always been a very good writer, very, very good with words. There were many letters that were discovered that he would write to Agnes that she's handed over. And, you can see the way that he talks and the way that he would try to swoon her with his words and seem, very open and honest. But I don't know, it's really honestly unsettling. So it seems that he took this opportunity to express himself to the court with this letter. And so the entire letter, he essentially bounced back and forth between being incredibly remorseful and apologizing to the Iverson family, apologizing to Sherrice, apologizing to Leroy, apologizing to Yolanda for what he had done, saying that he wished that he could take places with Sherrice, that what he did was awful and inexcusable, and there was no way he could ever make it right. But then in the same breath, he would follow this up with putting the blame on quite literally every other possible entity other than himself. And the whole 22 some pages read like this. Every paragraph would start off with, "I'm so sorry and I'll never take this back for, but blah, 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 blah." And it was over and over and over and over and over again. And I wanted to scream the entire time. He blamed the casino. He blamed alcohol. He blamed drugs. He blamed the adoption agency. He blamed mental health. He blamed his therapist. He blamed his psychiatrist. He blamed his medication. He blamed his ex-girlfriend. He blamed David. Quite literally every possible thing he could blame, he did. And the worst part of it is that he then had the nerve, you guys, the nerve. And when I tell you, my hair stood up on the back of my neck, he had the nerve to say that if people did better, kids like him and Sherrice would be protected from these kinds of things happening from them. Those are literally his words. He victimized himself beside Sherrice in a sentence. I just want to know, what does he think happened to him? What happened to him? He quite literally, manually with his bare hands killed a 7-year-old child. And so I have just been reeling for days. I agree to an extent that he shouldn't have just had an ADHD label slapped on him and been given amphetamines when he was already dependent on speed. Like, I already get there are so many different things that should have probably happened to help him in terms with his mental health, but that does not at all somehow make you victim to your own decided conscious actions. It just doesn't. If he had pled insanity, if he had some psychological evaluation, some, psychiatric evaluation that somehow came up with a diagnosis to where he was not aware of what he was doing. My understanding that was not done. That was not something that was found. And so I'm just absolutely baffled by his words and what he's essentially claiming in a very sneaky, sly way in this letter. And it's like he's disguising it with his big words and his intelligence. So to be that incredibly smart, to be able to speak that way, write that way, form the conclusions that he formed about this case, you will never fool me for a second that you were not fully aware of what you were doing, and trying to sneakily blame everyone else but yourself in that and to like slide in like, oh, guess what? I'm a victim too. It's not going to work. At least it's not working on my channel. He claimed in this letter, I'm not a sociopath. I am not a monster. I'm not a criminal. I'm not any of these things. He so badly tried to describe himself as being this innocent being, and then went on to refer to his ex-girlfriend who broke his heart as a psychopath. David was even described as a morally reprehensible sociopathic friend that is a, quote, callous brain without a heart or soul, which I'm not disagreeing with here. But how are you going to say that you are not a monster or a criminal or a sociopath, but then tell the court that your friend is that because he didn't stop you? He legitimately called David that, saying he's this awful human being. How dare he? He's reprehensible because he didn't stop me. What? Mind freaking blown. Like, what level of narcissism do you have to be on to believe it is everyone else's fault for not stopping you from murdering a little girl? Laurie Levinson of Loyola Law School said, quote, this case epitomized the worst in moral bankruptcy. It's everyone's nightmare come true. And while this did seem like a win yet again for Sherrice and for her family and everyone who was devastated in the loss of this little girl who had her entire future stripped away from her, there were a lot of people that were not at all satisfied. A lot of people felt that David should face some sort of charges because, again, there was no duty to act law or Good Samaritan law in Nevada or California. There was no way that he could have been charged according to authorities. One thing that I personally question is it's like, okay, I get that, he didn't have to immediately run off and say something. Should he have? Yes, morally, he should have gone and done something. However, is there no way he can be charged for, harboring that knowledge, for knowing right afterwards, there's a dead girl in that bathroom. My best friend killed her. He admitted it to me. And somehow he still doesn't have any sort of responsibility there legally to say anything or do anything. I mean, they literally crossed state lines back into California. This was devastating to so many people, but at a bare minimum, he could have at least been somewhat respectful when speaking about the death of Sherrice. He was quoted saying in the LA Times when asked, why he didn't turn Jeremy in, that, quote, I didn't want to be the person who takes away his last day, his last night of freedom. And then when he was asked if Jeremy was still his friend, he said, quote, yeah, he didn't do anything to me. He even said something along the lines of, am I supposed to sit down and cry about this forever? Like, let's be real here. How long do you guys want me to be upset? I'm not as upset as people probably want me to be. There's tons of people out in the world that are killed every day. There's people in Panama or Egypt or whatever he said that are starving and dying every single day, and he doesn't know them, so he doesn't feel any remorse for them. And he basically was like, I don't know Sherrice, so I don't feel remorse for her. I just feel bad for my friend. Like, in what world, you guys? In what world? And then he went on to say in the LA Times, he was quoted in the LA Times, that because of the notoriety in the case, he was even getting girls. because of what happened. Has gone on to deny saying a lot of this stuff, but this is what he's quoted saying by multiple journalists. He even said a lot of the stuff like personally on a radio interview. At this point, Jeremy's already been incarcerated. He's going to be spending life in prison. And David was freaking going on to go to Berkeley. He went to Berkeley University. And so Yolanda and the public that was angry, they all ended up reaching out to the LA Islamic community leader, Naji Ali. And they essentially started to make form a group of other defense leagues, like religious groups, radio stations that had been so disturbed and upset by what David said. And they decided to rally against David at Berkeley to try to get Berkeley to basically kick him out. And so they held this rally outside of Berkeley, and there were actually a handful of students that stopped and said that they didn't feel safe being there directly because of David. That if he was capable of totally ignoring the fact that his friend killed a 7-year-old, how are they supposed to feel safe being in a dorm room by him or underneath of him or being in a class with him or just being on campus in general with him? Other students ended up basically saying, you cannot simply remove someone from a school because they did something morally that was a mistake. Technically, because he did not commit any sort of crime, Berkeley said they had absolutely no basis to tell him to leave. So this rally pretty much did nothing. And this was devastating for a lot of people. But the shining light in all of this is that they fully planned on proposing a Good Samaritan law in Nevada. And so they were gathering signatures for this. Yolanda was working very diligently to get this passed. And finally, in 2000, after getting, I think, between 20 to 30,000 signatures, I've seen both, State Assembly Bill 267 was signed into law. And this was known as the Sherrice Iverson bill. I've seen it said like the Sherrice Iverson Memorial Bill. But essentially, this bill mandated citizens to report to authorities if they have reasonable concerns that a child under the age of 18 is being sexually assaulted or violently treated in any way, shape, or form, like abuse, the whole 9 yards. This bill makes it a misdemeanor to fail to report these sorts of crimes against children. Now, again, there's a lot of debate out there about whether these sorts of laws are actually good or not. It can be very tricky. I've spoken about it before, but just to briefly touch on it, in these cases, there's usually very specific requirements. State by state, things are very different as to what you can and cannot do in the situation. So sometimes in order to fall under the duty to act law, you only have to be like in certain relation to the victim, or like it has to be a certain level of danger or physical harm that someone's in. Sometimes, you have to just call police. You cannot personally physically act. Sometimes you do have to physically act. It's literally all across the board. And it's so tricky because this can put a lot of people under a lot of liability, to potentially be sued. There's a huge worry that someone will feel they are forced to act and do something to help someone, and they are not at all qualified to do so. And so if they jump in personally, physically, and do something and, it causes more harm, or there's something bad that comes out of it, or someone else gets hurt, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. And so that's where a lot of these laws kind of get hung up. And so this particular law, you don't physically jump in and do anything. I don't think that that's ever necessarily beneficial to call a professional to report it. However, I don't know how beneficial this is necessarily going to be because you have 24 hours to do so under this law. And in most of these cases, there is not that kind of time. It is an immediate life or death situation, and it needs to be dealt with. Now, one thing that this law does actually have that is very beneficial is that it protects those who report these suspicions from ever being sued if they are wrong. This little girl was so happy. Despite different challenges she may have been through, she still constantly showed up with a smile on her face. She was still always the girl who was polite, always the girl that was happy. And it's so upsetting to see that one person's horrible decision can totally take that away. Jeremy has in fact gone on to attempt to appeal multiple times. There was actually a grand jury held. There were a handful of attempts from Jeremy to kind of bring in the information about his biological parents' mental illness. Somehow that tied into everything that was going on. He's also claimed at this point, despite very clearly giving very detailed accounts of what happened, that he actually doesn't remember what happened that night, and he was blacked out the entire time. So he just conveniently forgot everything. And it was just kind of upsetting to see, because his attorney kept stating he doesn't remember what happened. He wants to go through a trial so he can learn what happened. And everyone was like, what do you mean so he can learn what happened? Like, literally look at your own confession. That tells you what happened. It doesn't seem he's denying being at fault. It's just this game of, oh, but I don't remember any of it, which maybe for a portion of it, he was blacked out. According to the grand jury, David testified that he did briefly try to stop him, that he told Jeremy, hey, get out of the bathroom, like, we've crossed a line here. He was tapping him on the forehead, accidentally knocked his hat off. And David said that Jeremy looked at him with just like blank expression, as if he didn't care what he was doing and wasn't planning on leaving. And maybe that was the case, or maybe he had started this new medication and had been drinking and he did black out. He remembered enough to confess to multiple individuals over the course of the next 4 days to killing Sherrice. So on top of that, it seems the most recent appeal, he has brought in specialists making claims that he was only 18 years old. So again, with I was a kid, saying that he wasn't cerebrally developed enough to understand right from wrong and the seriousness of his actions and like the consequences of those actions, and that they can be permanent to someone else. And so this was argued that when you're 18, like, that is just not a connection in your brain and you don't fully mature until like your early 20s. But ultimately the judge was like, absolutely the hell not. Jeremy was too smart. He was too well aware of himself to try to attempt to say that he did not know that it was wrong to kill someone. And that whole argument, I've seen it a handful of times, has never made a lot of sense to me, saying, well, I was young, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know right from wrong. If that was genuinely a thing of concern, we would have a lot more kids that were murderers, and we really don't. The judge essentially ended up telling Jeremy, from what's reported, to never step in front of him ever again. That Jeremy would absolutely be spending the rest of his life rotting in prison, and if it were up to pretty much anybody, he would never get out. However, his attorney has mentioned that they feel they have a very strong case to be able to have the confession thrown out and the data from the computer thrown out. So there was a mention of attempting to appeal again to try for a new case. His family has come forward and stated that he never wanted to do a plea deal. They didn't originally plan on agreeing to it, and now they feel that they basically were bullied into it, and so they want to take it all back now. So I don't know how that's going to go for them, if I'm being quite frank, because this is one of the most heinous crimes I have looked into. And when you're going to willingly hand over all of that information that so perfectly aligns with what was found, I just don't understand how you think you can just take it back. But regardless, that seems to be what they're going to try. However, the prosecution has stated that if that is the case, if he ends up getting a new trial, that they, without a doubt, will be going for the death penalty. So if that's a risk he's willing to take, to go for it, because they are going all the way this time. This was such a tragic story and such a devastating case to look into. This could have been prevented on so many different levels, and it's so rough to cover these cases. And the reason why I do it is to hope and pray that someone learns something, that this makes some sort of change in someone's life. Different decisions are made that keep someone safe. Or maybe encourages people to make better decisions in terms of how they react if they're a witness to these sorts of things. Because Sherrice deserved so much more than what she got. And at the bare minimum, something good has to come out of this. Like, it just has to, because if not, it sure does suck a lot of hope out of this world. On that note, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and go and let me know what you guys think about this and what you think about the fact that Jeremy wants to appeal and take back his confession and basically say he doesn't remember everything. Do you think that that's possible, or do you think that he is just trying to push away as much potential guilt and blame as possible? Let me know down in the comments below. Again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Sherrice's story. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.